Hi, welcome to Anaprime Recap. You are challenged to duel a fighter who can be completely set on fire, and who has the special ability to throw you into an illusion in the middle of combat. In today's video, we will continue our reports on the anime Baki, episodes 7, 8 and 9. The fight between the fighters continues, and after Hanayama gives Spec a real beating, Baki is surprised by Doyle, who approaches the young man during a test. In an attempt to lure his opponent away from his colleagues, after kicking the criminal in the face, the young man jumps out the window on the third floor and reaches the ground unharmed. As he walks away from the school, Baki spots a guy in a cap tending the garden. Seconds later, the young man bends down and almost gets his head blown off by a scythe. He soon discovers that that gardener is actually Yunagi, an inmate who had escaped from prison and was there to fight the champion. The man had a rope in his hands with a scythe tied to each end. His incomparable speed meant that Baki could barely see the blade. Yunagi launches the first blow, but the young man narrowly dodges it. Luckily, Baki also dodges the second attack, but now the man is even faster. He hands one of his weapons to the young man, but soon manages to destroy it. Baki ends up being hit, but only his shirt is torn, his body remains undamaged. Even if he is not as fast as Yunagi, his reflexes are very sharp. Suddenly a voice comes from behind the criminal and throws a pot of boiling water over him. The man remembers the moment he did the same to Shibukawa and cries out in pain from the burns caused to his body. However, seconds later he realizes that he has been tricked. That water was cold and the feeling that he was being burned was just a trap of his brain. Realizing that the old man was making fun of his face, Yunagi tries to attack him with the teapot, but Shibukawa uses his own body to knock him down and finishes with a blow to his chin. Some years ago, a dentist named Mitsuomi Hasegawa, director of the Japanese Dental Association, did some studies proving that the strength of a person's bite is directly proportional to his physical performance. He came to this conclusion after analyzing the teeth of thousands of athletes who excelled in their sport. It is impossible to lift a heavy object with your mouth open and your jaw relaxed. Therefore, the bite of these athletes was much stronger than that of an ordinary human being. While collecting data for his research, he examined Yunagi's teeth. His molars were almost completely worn down, indicating that he had to train hard to get them in that state. When the fight seemed to be lost, the man pulls out his bog knock, a special weapon made in India, and scratches Shibukawa's arm. At this point, Baki joins the old man in eliminating the criminal. After throwing blood in Yunagi's eyes in order to obstruct his vision, Shibukawa attacks his enemy and the young man helps to knock him out. Caught between a cross and a sword, the former inmate must dodge the young fighter's powerful punch. He tries to fight back with a kick, but ends up being thrown straight into the arms of Shibukawa, who immobilizes him while Baki plans his next attack. This time, however, Yunagi manages to land a kick to the young man's face and leaps out of the old man's clutches. When this happens, Shibukawa reveals to Baki that, in fact, that man's specialty is not weapon attack, but rather the ability to poison. Yunagi is able to knock out an opponent 3 times his size through hypoxia. The atmosphere around the Earth has 21% oxygen. When this percentage drops to 15%, the human body stops functioning properly and begins to suffer from dizziness, chills, nausea, and vomiting. But in the palm of his hands, this man can concentrate air with less than 6% oxygen. If a person inhales this air only once, he will be unconscious and will only be able to stand up again 12 hours later. This technique was developed by Yunagi and has made him known as the Poisoner. In this way, he can take Baki down in a few seconds. His technique even allows him to destroy the most different types of materials by creating a vacuum in the palm of his hand. As he demonstrates his unique skill, police cars approach the scene and Yunagi flees. Baki gets up and Shibukawa informs him that this time, unfortunately, he has lost the battle. Hours later, while they were gathered with other fighters, Mr. Tokugawa states that they suffered that shameful defeat, even though they had the upper hand, because, although they were professional fighters, they were amateurs in street fighting. The old man finishes by saying that all the applause they received in their battles meant nothing, for a warrior who loses a fight has no value. Hanayama is annoyed by this and grabs the old man by the collar of his shirt. At this point, Tokugawa says that of all the people in that room, he was the one who was most upset by that defeat. He says he believed in the potential of those fighters more than anyone else and was disappointed by what had happened. After the sermon, Baki gets up to leave, but when he opens the door he is surprised by the presence of Dorian, a gigantic man who had escaped from his prison in the United States to go to Japan to meet defeat. Mr. Tokugawa wonders where his security guards are, but Dorian had already eliminated all of them. That psychopath had a bucket of gasoline and a lighter in his hands and intended to set the place on fire to get rid of all his opponents in one go. But Katsumi, Doppo Orochi's adopted son, arrives just in time. The young man holds the white-haired man's shoulder and asks him if he remembers him. Katsumi snatches the lighter from his hands and literally kicks the bucket over him, leaving Dorian drenched in gasoline. After knocking him down, the young man thanks him for the beating he took a few days earlier, because from then on he has learned the difference between a sport and a real fight. He then uses the lighter to set the man on fire, as a way of getting revenge for what he had done the first time they met. Dorian writhes on the ground with his body on fire as everyone watches in awe. When the fire goes out, burners can be noticed on all parts of his body. The fighters consider calling an ambulance to help him, but Retsu realizes that something is wrong. The Chinese man had faced that man once before and knew very well that he did not play fair. Before the psychopath can move, Retsu attacks him, but Dorian manages to deflect. Even though his body is badly wounded, the man asks who his first opponent will be. Doppo Orochi applies. After all, that man had ripped off his left hand and he needed revenge. But suddenly, Kiyosumi Kato, Katsumi's master, arrives at the dojo. He is a member of the Shin Shinkai and one of the best karate fighters in the academy. However, instead of training in the dojo, he prefers to train in street fights. Upon seeing his master's torn fist, the young man becomes enraged and attacks Dorian. The criminal tries to knock him down with a kick, but Kato manages to dodge the attack. Finally, he uses a fishing line to rip off his opponent's left ear. Thus, the young man is able to avenge his sensei. Doppo Orochi asks his son if that man was really his master, and Katsumi states that Kato does not allow his pride and ego to interfere in his fight. Therefore, his preparation against real combat is greater than that of Orochi and even all the other members of the Shin Shinkai. The one-armed man then launches a surprise attack on Dorian and claims that he will show those young men the true essence of Shin Shinkai. Nobody understands why he did this. After all, that man had already been defeated. But soon after, Kato and Katsumi realize that they have been caught by Dorian's aramid fiber, the same one he used to rip off Orochi's hand. The sensei uses his own fist to cut the line. If he did not do this, the two young men would be killed immediately. He then goes on to report that karate training turns the hands and feet of its practitioners into weapons. It takes hard training and unmatched dedication, but after a few years of intense training, your fists become so sharp that they become blades. Therefore, its practitioners do not need to use weapons during combat. Orochi turns to Kato and says that karate means empty hands, and one day, when the young man is good enough at that martial art, he will no longer need to carry a fishing line in his pocket. Trapped and wounded, Dorian decides to use his last resort to get out of that place alive. He expels a grenade from his mouth and causes an explosion capable of destroying the entire dojo. The policemen interrogate Mr. Tokugawa in order to find out what happened there and how he had survived, but the old man informs them that someone threw him away from the explosion, and when he woke up everyone was gone. In the streets of Japan, Dorian was walking with his body covered by a cloth. Everyone was watching him attentively because it was clear that there was something wrong with this man. He walks into an alley, where he finds a poor guy relieving himself on the corner. His countenance is so frightening that the guy runs away before he can even close his zipper. Dorian then enters the sewer and ends up falling down at a very high speed. He must use his feet and hands to hold on to the sides of the pipe, otherwise he could suffer a fatal fall. When he finally reaches the ground, he heads for an underground shelter. Apparently, ever since he arrived in Tokyo, the man had been using that place as his hiding place. He pours booze on his severed ear and uses some bandages to stop the bleeding. At this moment, Kato appears and reveals that he has been following the criminal all this time. Dorian claims that the young man is no match for him and asks him to leave, but Kato is determined to confront him. He throws the first kick, but the white-haired psychopath grabs his leg and throws him away. He then breaks several drink bottles and covers his hands with grease, which he uses to stick the shards of glass together. The man asks his opponent to do the same, but instead Kato takes the steel barrel and tries to hit him. However, with one punch, Dorian manages to shake off the attack and brutally throws the barrel back at the young man, who narrowly manages to dodge it. The fight continues and the mountain of muscle uses his glass-covered fists to cause a cut on the young man's foot. As a member of the Shin Shinkai, Kato could not abandon that fight. Even though wounded, he executes his next attack, but Dorian is a cold-blooded killer and throws several shards of glass in his opponent's face. With his vision impaired, Kato can barely see the powerful punch he takes shortly thereafter. Still, he gets up and tries to land a few blows, but Dorian easily dodges them all and even breaks a wine bottle over his head. Finally, he uses the same bottle to cause deep cuts on his face. Suddenly, the ex-convict starts singing a macabre song while destroying Kato. However, unexpectedly, even after being beaten badly, the young man manages to fight back and throws several bottles at his enemy. For a brief moment, he hits Dorian several blows in a row and his self-confidence is renewed. Kato, in fact, believes he can win. He lands several punches and kicks on his enemy, until the man begins to beg for mercy. But Kato allows pride to take over and takes pleasure in piercing the man's eyes with his own fingers. He celebrates his victory, but within minutes he comes back to reality and discovers that he had actually fallen for his opponent's trick. Dorian reveals that he used his hypnosis technique to manipulate the fight. Since Kato had a strong will to win, he became vulnerable to hypnosis and his mind created a parallel reality where he actually defeats his enemy. However, it had all been an illusion created by his brain. The psychopath lands a hook on the young man's face and uses his aramid fiber to cut his neck. In this way, Dorian emerges victorious from yet another battle. A few hours later, at the Shin Shinkai headquarters, Retsu is getting ready to train, and as he approaches the punching bag, he senses that something is wrong inside. He rips open the leather cover and what he finds leaves him terrified. Kato was inside, in a near-death state. After calling the ambulance, Katsumi orders the association members to distribute Dorian's picture to the more than 600 Shin Shinkai branches in Japan. At that moment, a search began for the man who had slaughtered Kiyosumi Kato. That night, Dorian is in disguise and goes to a restaurant in town. After dinner, one of the waiters approaches him and calls him by name. Apparently, his cover had been blown. The man also reveals that Dorian had made enemies across the country with all the thousands of Shin Shinkai members and says that from now on everything he does in Japan will be closely monitored. Outside the restaurant, he encounters dozens of karate fighters who were thirsty for revenge. After getting past those men, Dorian gets into a cab, but soon realizes that the driver is also a member of the Shin Shinkai. He prepares his aramid fiber to put an end to that guy, but the young man reveals that just like him, all the men who were driving the vehicles around him also belonged to the same association. At that moment, Dorian realizes that there is nowhere to run. His cab was being followed by cars, trucks, police cars, fire trucks and ambulances. All those drivers were members of the Shin Shinkai and were there to fulfill a single mission: to make sure that Dorian is taken to an amusement park. When they arrive at the place, the cab driver asks the man to enter the park. Dorian knows that there is someone waiting for him inside and thanks the men for the favor they have done him by taking him to that place. But before he gets in, he challenges the cab driver to a fight, in which all the rules of Shin Shinkai would apply. The man readily accepts the challenge. He tries to strike Dorian in every way, but the psychopath manages to block all his attacks. Finally, with a single kick to the jaw, the former prisoner knocks his opponent out. He uses that fight to prove that none of those men would have the slightest chance of beating him alone. And they could not unite to fight a single target, because the rules of the Shin Shinkai only allowed one-on-one combat. Therefore, Dorian was invincible for them. After this show of strength, he enters the playground excited for his next battle. Dorian suspects that Retsu is inside waiting for him and can't wait to slaughter him like he did Kato. Will the Chinese Kenpo expert be able to defeat one of the greatest criminals of all time? So, what did you think of this anime? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like it and subscribe for more anime recaps. See you next time.